Okay, welcome to lecture 5 part 2, and this one is going to be on vagueness. um, for those that haven't been back to the uni for a while, that's what it looks like. There are people like that sitting there all over the place. Okay, so we're going to be talking about vagueness. One of the things to identify when we talk about vagueness is that it actually contrasts with a bunch of other phenomena. And to get a grip on what vagueness is, it's often useful to contrast it with other phenomena. So, for example, it's not the same thing as ambiguity, and it's not obscurity. It's a phenomenon that turns up when you have a lack of clear borders. So whenever you have a borderline case in a concept, that's the idea of a case which is neither a clear case of the concept nor is the clear case of a contrary concept. So there are borderline cases in many concepts. Baldness is a vague concept because there are borderline cases. Cases where the person is not clearly bald and not clearly not bald. Okay, so it's got admits of borderline. But it's not just baldness. There are really important concepts that we use all the time that are vague. So, for example, the distinction between being alive and being dead is a vague distinction, and that means that that being alive admits of borderline cases, and so does being dead. So it's not plausible that there's always going to be a last moment of being alive or the first moment of being dead. Death is a bit like dusk. The darkness that falls at dusk doesn't just go off like a light. It gets darker and darker, and so similarly, you can imagine it is with being conscious or being alive. These are admitted borderline cases. They fall gradually. So if we're trying to understand a concept that is vague, one of the important things to understand about it is the way it admits of vagueness and just what that vagueness means. And if we're trying to analyze a concept that we think of as a vague concept, then that analysis that we produce, the definition that we produce, has to be the sort of thing that admits of just the same sort of vagueness as the thing we're analyzing. Because if we were to analyze it with a concept that isn't vague, then we would have analyzed a different concept. We'd be producing an analysis for a non-vague concept, whereas our concept was vague. And as I said, death is just one example of a vague concept. In fact, we use these concepts all the time, all to get around the world, and maybe most of our concepts are in fact vague. If you think for a moment about these concepts, the contrast between someone's being an adult and a juvenile, the contrast between someone's being intelligent and stupid, brave and cowardly, beautiful and ugly, healthy, unhealthy, inexperienced, experienced, impoverished, wealthy, cool, uncool, mammal, reptile, orange or red, I'm thinking of the colours there, or hot and cold. These are concepts with gradations between them. And arguably there's no single, there are going to be cases that are neither one nor the other, or at least where we feel that that's how we think about them. Now, one of the things that we do use vagueness for, the concept of vagueness, to criticize someone. So we might say someone is too vague, right? And there what we're actually criticizing is something about what they've said. So you can imagine cases where you've got a wall of letter boxes in front of you, and you ask the box where this letter goes, and he says over there. Maybe that would be enough, but maybe you need to know just which letterbox it's got to go into. So there are cases where you can be too vague to be helpful, like where exactly over there. Which letterbox you might want to know. And it might be in this case that which one the letter goes into really matters. But on the other hand, if a receptionist says to you, you can sit over there, and she gestures to a bunch of chairs, that could be vague but perfectly useful. You don't need to be told to sit in a precise chair, or which precise chair to sit in. So the fact that an utterance has got vagueness in it doesn't mean it's inevitably flawed. You might think that, and some people have said that, vagueness should not be tolerated in philosophy. Some people have said, well, this can be taken in two ways. First, that philosophers have tried to deny that there's such a thing as vagueness in our concepts, or that any concept which is vague is one that, for that reason, can't be used to describe the world. That's a strong view about what the world is like and how our concepts have to behave if they're going to actually be used to describe the world. But both those views, by the way, the idea are actually quite implausible. There are some philosophers, and we'll see one in a moment, who do deny that vagueness exists, or at least deny that there's any vagueness in the world. But not all philosophers do. Right, when we describe the world, even in science, we use concepts that are inevitably going to have some aspect of vagueness. That's a feature of applying our language to the world. But if the world really is vague, then if we're describing it, then we've got to use concepts which are vague, or else we're actually not going to be faithful to our world that we're trying to describe. And you might really wonder, could there really be a sharp line between the colours such as red and orange? Could there really be a line that says, on this side of the line you're red, on that side of the line you're orange? This is the hue. This is the one that matters. Could there really be such a line? Well, okay, remember the second way of taking this claim is to say that philosophers have got a blind spot, an intellectual blind spot as far as vagueness is concerned. According to this sort of charge, it's that using logic and the way you've been learning to use it in this course is a way of denying vagueness is all over the place. And you might even think about the two concepts, or two of the principles that we've been using, non-contradiction and bivalence, as examples of this. Remember, the first non-contradiction says that no sentence is both true and false. The second says that every sentence is either true or false. Now, consider a particular card with a hue on it, a colour hue. And suppose that it's a hue that ordinary perceivers are reluctant to call red and reluctant to call orange. Now think about the sentence. I say ordinary perceivers because I'm reluctant all over the place because of my my color blindness. But ordinary people also are often reluctant to say it's definitely red or it's definitely orange, right? Now think about the sentence that says, yeah, this hue is red. Now, the principle of bivalence says that this sentence is either true or false. But what do we think? Do we think that it's either true or false? Isn't supposing that every hue in the range, I mean, we have the clear reds over here and the clear oranges over here, and then there's a gradation between the two, right? And somewhere in here, if we've got our hue, why do we really think that the sentence "this hue is red" is either going to be definitely, true or false? It seems like we should be reluctant to say that. So let's try and get some clarity about how to think about what we actually do, but how we actually should think of vagueness. How should we think about it? And the reason to focus on a really mundane example like the color is that I'm predicting that you have had these experiences of not wanting to call a hue red or orange, of saying things like, oh, it's a kind of reddy orange or orangey red, or it's somewhere in there. So you've got some inclinations already, and my inclinations are that it's certainly true to say the hue that we've chosen really is either red or orange, because after all there is no other color in that range. Remember, we've got the reds, where were the reds? Reds over here and the oranges over there, and it's in there. So it's not like there's a new color in there. It's either red or orange. There's no other color for it to be. But I certainly don't feel comfortable saying H is red, nor saying H is orange. And I certainly don't want to say that it's both red and orange. There's a strong sense that red and orange are contraries. They exclude each other. So remember that distinction between contraries and contradictories. Color's a really good example of contraries. We can imagine concepts that are like our color, but are in fact our color concepts, but are actually different from them in that they're both precise and that they overlap. So, have something like a football season and cricket season. Once upon a time, when I was a little boy, cricket season and football season did not overlap. And so the same people could play both. And they have sharp boundaries. There's a first game and there's a last game, right? And you could imagine that concepts like this, but where they actually overlap, where red and orange are or surrogates for our concepts of red and orange are overlapping concepts. So they overlap and they could be precise as you like. The thing about this is we could have had concepts like this. I can imagine we had concepts like this. And we have examples of it with football season and cricket season. As I say, they now overlap. But it's also clear that this is not the way our color concepts work. They really are contraries. So saying something is red means that you're implying that it's not blue, it's not orange, and not yellow, and not any of the other colors, right? So saying something is red is saying it's not another color. Okay, so now what I want to do is talk about some approaches to vagueness, and three major approaches. You'll see there's kind of a gesture towards a fourth as well, but it's not as well worked out. So I'll leave it as 3 approaches. The first approach is what's known as the epistemic theory, epistemic theory of vagueness. Now, as far as we know, the original discussion of vagueness was raised by a ancient Greek logician from Miletus called Eubulides, and this is a quote from him, well, translated into English. He says, "Would you call 1 grain of sand a heap? Well, no. 2? No. But eventually you will call it a heap. Where will you draw the line and why?" Another version of the paradox of vagueness that the ancient Greeks worked on was the bald man. So it goes, a man with no hairs on his head, is he bald? Yes. A man with 1 hair on his head, is he bald? Well, yes. A man with 2 hairs on his bald, is he bald? Yes. And down. So if we just increase it by 1 each time, we can get to a man with 150,000 hairs on his head. Is he bald? Well, no. He's got a full head of hair, right? And we can represent this as, let's say that a man with N hairs on his head is bald. If we just add 1 hair, right, so the base case is a bald man with no hairs on his head, B 0. Right, he's got no hairs on his head. N stands for a number. Right? So the inductive step is that if a man has N hairs on his head and he's bald, then adding 1 hair to his head won't make him not bald. Right? That's called the inductive step. That's what takes you from the case that you're considering to the next case. So if he's got 0 hairs, he's bald. If you're adding 1 hair to his head, that won't stop him from being bald. So if he has 1 hair, he's still bald. And so if he's bald and you add 1 hair to his head, he's not going to be not bald. Right? He will still be bald. So a bit formally, so if N hairs have you being bald, then N plus 1 hairs will also have you being bald. But then given the base case and the inductive step, it would seem to follow by logic alone that given you start off with 0 hairs and you can get through all the numbers this way, no matter how many hairs he's got on his head, he will be bald. Even a person with a full head of hair, where we're wondering where to stick that extra hair, that person will be bald. So for any number, that person, and any number of hairs, that person will be bald. Look, this is clearly wrong. A person with a full head of hair is not bald. Okay? Now that more formal version of the argument has 2 principles. One is that a person with no hair on his head is bald, and the next is the inductive step, the step that said if you have N hairs on your head and you're bald, then adding 1 more head to the head of a bald man won't make him not bald. Those are the 2 assumptions that we used. And it's certainly clear that a person with no hair on their head is in fact bald. So it looks like the other assumption is much less good. So it looks quite suspicious now to say that if every time we have a bald man, if we add 1 hair, it won't be bald. But for it to be bald means that for it to be false means that it's not true for all N that property holds. And that means that for a particular number N, we do have that having N hairs on your head is bald, and you're not bald if you have N plus 1. But that suggests that there really is a border between the bald and the not bald. This is actually similar to an argument that Timothy Williamson from Oxford University uses to argue for sharp borders. He thinks that this argument, properly understood, gives you a reason to deny that vagueness exists. Now, when he says this, he's not denying our reluctance to call various hues of colour orange and red, or nor is he denying that there are lots of cases where we feel uncomfortable saying that a person is bald or not bald. But what he wants to argue is that what we tend to think of as vagueness in the world is in fact not that, but a matter of our not knowing what to say. He treats vagueness as an epistemic matter, that is, as a matter of what we actually know. And so from that perspective, there really is a border between the bald and the not bald. But the problem for us is we don't know what that border is. We're ignorant of it. So for this position to work, for baldness, for example, it means that there's the indeterminacy that we feel with applying the case of baldness. That's not about the meaning of the word is bald. The meaning is absolutely clear, and there are sentences like John is bald that are true or false determinately that we don't know. The situation with his theory is that the predicate is bald has sharp boundaries, and they're perfectly determinate in its meaning. So the words have a clear meaning, but we don't know that meaning, and our knowledge is less than determinate. Right? So what we lack is knowledge of its meaning, because if we had that, we'd know where the border was. So there's if you want the explanation for vagueness from Williamson's perspective, it's about our lack of knowledge of the meanings of our own words. So this is the epistemic theory. And the thing to remember is that from this perspective, there's no vagueness in the world. Well, there's much of the vagueness isn't in the world. It's actually in our ways of talking about the world and our knowledge of the meaning of our words. So there's not even vagueness in our language, according to this account. Right? So the language is perfectly determinate. All these predicates like orange and bald and adult and all these concepts have got perfectly sharp boundaries. What goes wrong is our knowledge of our language. That's what throws us off. That's what means that we don't know whether we should be applying it or not. If we only knew the true meaning of is bald as we use it in our own mouths, if we knew what the meanings of the words in our own mouths were, we'd know where the boundary was. But we lack that knowledge, and so we don't. By the way, this does seem to be echoing some of the ancient Stoics' views as well. Remember, the Stoics are the guys who invented propositional logic. The Stoics were really interesting philosophers. They, in fact, much of their writing has not made it to us. You know, I mentioned Chrysippus at the beginning of the first part of this lecture as an inventor of propositional logic. Chrysippus wrote something like 700 books, and of that 700 we have none, absolutely none. Right? So What we have are other people's accounts of what he said. This makes it hard to know whether they got him right, etc. But in any case, the Stoics seem to have this sort of view about determinate meaning and our ignorance of it as part of their way of thinking about vagueness. What I want to say, though, about this view, be trying to motivate it a bit, which is the way to do things, right? To try and make things seem plausible. But what I want to say about it is that it's kind of very strange. And what's really strange in particular is this picture of meaning that this theory has. On the epistemic theory of vagueness, remember, it says that the locus or the explanation for our reluctance to be able to call this hue orange or red is our knowledge of our own concept of orange and red. Right? Or the same with, is John bald? Well, we're reluctant. We know he's balding, but is he actually bald? Hard. So, on their theory, the word bald in our mouths has a determinate application, and John is either bald or not bald, even though we don't seem to know which. But this is really odd, right? Because it's not like the word bald has a meaning independent of the way we use the word in the world. It's not like there's some special people who know, and they're the ones that meaning comes from. No, everyone's in the same boat. And if we're all in the same boat, how does the meaning of bald get to be so much more determinate than any of our uses of it? How can that be? How does it have a meaning and an application that so far outstrips our use of it? It seems to be a real problem. And there's a feeling that even if there are some cases in which our uses have narrowed pinned down our concepts and perhaps narrowed them down a whole lot more than we realize, I think that's probably true. The idea that the meanings have pinned down all these seemingly vague concepts seems to be really hard to take seriously. And so because of this, it's not surprising that this epistemic theory, although Williamson is certainly no fool, he's a really gifted philosopher, he supports it and argues for it. It's actually not very popular. It hasn't won over. And that was our first approach to vagueness, which is the epistemic theory. The second approach of the three and a bit is the fuzzy logic approach. This one I feel embarrassed about whenever I talk about, because once upon a time I used to argue for this. So what some people have said is that we should be using a different sort of logic, a fuzzy logic, to approach vagueness. So what is fuzzy logic? Fuzzy logic gets used now in washing machines and all sorts of things. But really, I do want to make a mea culpa here and talk about why I thought it was the way to go. And then I'll explain why I think it's actually barking up the wrong tree. So when I was an undergrad, I was working on biological classification. And for my honours thesis, I did a bunch of work on using fuzzy set theory and fuzzy logic as a way of modelling the the classification of evolving systems. That was something that I did. I admit I was young. I didn't know as much as I thought I knew. Blah blah blah. Right? I mean, I thought it would be a simpler solution than it turned out to be. All right. So let me first describe my problem, the problem I was dealing with, and say why I thought and why others have thought, both around my time and after me as well, by the way, that this was the way to do things. And what I then want to do is to show you why it didn't really work. Okay, so these are micrographs of Cretaceous, early Cretaceous mammals. And I was working on these fossils that date from the early Cretaceous, about 125 million years ago. And the fossils were very partial. They tended to be isolated teeth, and they were really hard to find. One guy spent over 20 years going through vast amounts of sand from the Trinity Formation, which was the fossil group I worked on most, and he found 28 isolated teeth. These 28 teeth that he spent 20 years finding basically got reclassified again and again, and people were saying that these were the first marsupials, they were saying the first placentals, they were saying no, they weren't in either group. In any case, it was a real problem, and it struck me that part of the problem was this drive to want to put them into these discrete categories. So we're dealing with these lineages, right? These lineages that are evolving, and when we think today about what it means for something to be a marsupial, and that's quite different from what it is to be a placental, right? The marsupials are things like koalas and kangaroos and the thylacine and Tasmanian devil and all that. The placentals are you, me, whales, rats, go on and on, lions, dogs, cats, all those things. Right? So it's actually kind of interesting to compare the two today. They're really quite different. Right? And then what happens is we think our way back to where these lineages split. So there's a point at which there was one bunch of Therians, and they've split up into at least two lineages, the marsupial lineage and the placental lineage. There were others back then as well, the Deltatheriidae and others, but we don't need to talk about them. So we've got this idea that the marsupials and the placentals have got a common ancestor, and so you've got this picture, say, of a lineage splitting and giving rise to the marsupials and the placentals. In case you were wondering, the echidna and the platypus split off long before that, and it's like a separate line that comes off long before this split between the marsupials and the placentals. Okay, so what is it to be a marsupial? Well, the more you think about it, you think in terms of all these characteristics that we think of as marsupial characteristics. But the more and more I thought about it, that was the bit that we had represented as a point at which there's a split between the two lineages Well, the more you think about it, it's more like a smear, because even after they've split, the two lineages are way more similar to each other than either of them is to either modern marsupials or modern placentals. Now, if you're thinking in terms of what they're like, marsupials today are much more, way, let me put this another way. Marsupials at the point early on in the split, or things that we put on that lineage, are much more like placentals at that time than they are like marsupials today. So the sort of features that we think of as marsupial features are features that evolved on that lineage. But at the split, they would not be, they'd be much more similar to each other than either of them is to their modern descendants. So I thought, why not say that the marsupials and the placentals are actually fuzzy sets? So you've got a full member of the marsupial when they've got all those characteristics that we think of as marsupial characteristics, like having a pouch and the type of placenta that they have and the type of brain that they have. There's all these different characteristics we don't need to worry about. And so when you've got all those features, you're fully a marsupial. But you know, you can be partially a marsupial. You can get there incrementally. And so why not think of them as fuzzy sets, where not everything is a member to the same degree. Now, fuzzy sets don't have sharp boundaries, so it's actually wrong to ask when they first evolved. It was a gradual thing, and that seemed to be like on the right path, right? That seemed to be respecting the fact that we're talking about evolving systems here, systems that evolve gradually or can possibly. But that's what I wanted to say. And you know, we do have groups in biology. We have a group, I don't know if you know about this group, there's a group of early reptiles called the mammal-like reptiles. And they have a mixture of mammal and reptile features. And so there's this idea, it's a bit like calling a hue orangey red, because it's orangey but it's still red, right? So the biological world is like that too. But actually, let's look at how, that's what I wanted to do with it, but let's look at how it actually works. So ordinary logic, it's got every predicate is sharp, right? For every object it either has or hasn't got that property. That's guaranteed by the principle of bivalence. And so for being bald, on a classical understanding of this, in say set theory or logic, there's a set of bald people. And everything is either in that set or not. And we can say that a person receives the value 1 if they're bald and receives the value 0 if they're not. And everyone gets either a value 1 or a value 0. So the universe of people divides up into the ones who are bald and the zeros who are not. Okay. So everyone is either a 1 or a 0. Fuzzy logic says, oh, no, we don't do it that way anymore. We've got degrees of baldness. We give them 1 if they're definitely bald, and we give them 0 if they're definitely not bald. But we've got all the real values between 0 and 1, all the real values to tell us their degree of baldness, their degree to which they are in the set of bald people. So someone wasn't really bald but was balding, might get a value of 0.05. Someone else might be more bald than that. Still not fully bald, but they could be 0.62. right? So there's this idea that there's, and this is the basic idea in fuzzy logic, that you replace on-off thinking with matters of degree. Okay, you might be thinking, this is sensible, I like it, what could go wrong? Well, first, is this really the way we should understand vagueness? Because remember, we had this hard idea, this hard time trying to decide whether John was bald or not bald. And now we're going to have to decide whether they're bald to 0.56 or bald to 0.58. Right? So, and, now we're in more trouble. Right? How do we decide that? And actually, this is part of why I came to think that fuzzy logic was a bankrupt approach to making sense of vagueness. I thought that what it had, and you can see that now, it's making the mistake of being too determinate, curiously, right? Because whereas in the past we just had a property like is bald, and fuzzy logic is determinate with lots and lots and lots of predicates like is bald to degree 0.435. And now you've got to decide that, the degree of baldness that they have. There is a way out of this pickle when I've talked to people that advocate for fuzzy logic. This is what they've tended to do. But this way of out of this particular pickle really is sort of cutting off your nose to spite your face, as the old saying goes. Because what they'll do is, instead of simply saying, John is bald to degree 0.053, what they'll say is that this sentence itself, John is bald to degree 0.435 or whatever, itself has a degree of truth. So it's true to a certain degree, right? And so where you had a sentence like John is bald or John is not bald, now you've got a whole family of claims that are true to different degrees. So you'll have, John is bald is true to degree 0.053, is itself true to degree 0.5. His being bald to degree 0.456 is true to a different degree, and so on. Right? This is supposed to be progress in making sense of vagueness, but I think you can see that this is not the way to model vagueness. We've gone from the idea that things are fuzzy to the idea that they're actually, instead of being fuzzy, they're massively determinate to all sorts of precise degrees that make very little sense. Okay, that's all I want to say about fuzzy logic and why I think it actually fails as an approach to vagueness. Now I want to talk about a third approach, which is a really interesting one. This is called supervaluations theory, and it was invented originally by a logician called Kit Fine, an English logician who's worked in New York for the last 30 years. And probably the most prominent advocate of this approach was the person whose little argument you analysed over the weekend, and if you didn't, I really recommend that you go back and have a look at it, David Lewis. And David Lewis was one of my teachers, in fact my supervisor for most of my PhD. And he was the person that most powerfully argued for this approach. I can say that look on his face is a disturbing look on this. I used to have that photo above my desk, and I had to put it away because that's the look David Lewis gives you when you've said something to him that he doesn't agree with, and there's a half smile and he's calculating out the consequences of your view and just why it's wrong. He was a very, very brilliant philosopher. Okay, so supervaluations. The idea here is that our language, the language that you and I speak, is actually indeterminate. And that as we use our language, we fix the meanings of our words in all sorts of ways. But we don't do enough of it to answer all the questions. And so the semantics for our language, the theory of meaning for our language, leaves many questions unanswered. So there's actually no fact of the matter about, for example, whether John is bald. John, the clear cases, the cases that are settled by our previous practice have determined clear cases of baldness and clear cases of not baldness, and the clear cases don't include John. So he's neither bald, neither clearly bald, nor is he clearly not bald. So if we look at this little diagram, we've got the bald, the cases, the indeterminate cases, and the not bald cases, and John somewhere in the indeterminate ones. Now, what the supervaluations approach says is that our predicate is not sharp. But we can imagine lots and lots of different ways to sharpen the meaning of our words. In fact, we can think about lots and lots of different ways of in which we could have sharpened our concept of baldness. And every way of sharpening our concept is like a fictional sharp model of our actual vague concept. So we can imagine putting various sharp boundaries for baldness. And on some, John would be on the bald side, and on others, John would be on the not bald side. Right? So there's lots and lots of sharp places we could draw lines, and John could fit on either side depending on where we draw the line in our sharp boundaries that we fictionally consider drawing. Well, according to the supervaluations approach, what is true, using our own vague notion of baldness, is what's true according to each and every sharpening of that concept. So each and every sharpening of our real vague concept, if it's true according to each and every sharpening of it, then it's true about our concept. And if it's false according to each and every sharpening of it, then it's false according to our vague concept. So what's true is what's true according to each and every sharpening of the concept. But since we've seen that for John's bald according to some sharpenings, and according to some other ones, he's not bald. Neither the sentence John is bald, nor the sentence John is not bald, is true according to the supervaluational approach. And that's because there's some sharpenings of which he is bald and some sharpenings of which he's not bald. But now consider this sentence. John is bald or not bald. So according to every sharpening of the sentence John is bald or John is not bald, all the sharpenings of our concept, the sentence John is bald or John is not bald, that sentence comes out to be true. And sometimes it's true because John is bald on that sharpening, and sometimes it's made true by the fact that John is not bald on that sharpening. So on the supervaluation approach, bivalence fails because John is bald is not true and not false, right? But the law of excluded middle, A or not A, that's true, even though it's not true that every sentence is either true or false. Right? So it seems intuitive that John is either bald or not bald. After all, there isn't an alternative, in the same way as it was intuitive that the hue was either going to be orange or red, because there's no other color in there. But he's actually fails to be bald and fails to be not bald because of the very vagueness that we're exploring. Okay, so there are reasons to worry about this approach too. After all, it uses this fictive notion of a sharpening of our concepts, and isn't that as bad as degrees of truth? Because they are as sharp can be. Isn't that as bad as the degrees of truth on degrees of truth of fuzzy logic? Well, yes, but the biggest problem for me is that it says that there's a sharp boundary for the vague concept, because think about what's true on every sharpening. On every sharpening, there is a sharp boundary. So according to our vague concept, according to the supervaluations approach, there is a sharp boundary for bald. Because on every sharpening, there's a sharp boundary for bald. And that is a bad result. Okay. So supervaluations was our third approach. Now let me just briefly say something about another approach, which is taking paradigms, not borders. And I think there's something to this approach. So implicit in the way that we've been talking is this idea of trying to delineate concepts by drawing boundaries. And the idea that we understand important concepts that way. Well, what about changing our focus? What if we say, actually, that's not the way we understand our important concepts. It's the way we understand the notion of something's being read is not by knowing where boundaries are, but rather by focusing on paradigms of the concept read. And that actually gives us a fourth approach to vagueness, using paradigms. So the idea here is that to understand red is to understand a bunch of paradigms of colors, and how they relate to each other. And to have mastery over the concept of red, you need to be able to say, of a particular hue, say, if it's closer to the paradigm red or paradigm orange, for example. The colors don't have boundaries. What they have is paradigms. They're the clear examples. And that means that orange is a concept that gets its content by dint of its relation to other color concepts. You need to know how it relates not just to red, but also to other colors such as yellow, right? And to think of these concepts in terms of binary oppositions here is way too simple-minded. So the concept of the color orange is situated in a system of colors, And to understand orange is to understand how it relates to other concepts. And people who tend to think that there are oppositions will have a tendency to value one against the other. They seem to have got it wrong, right? Just because we understand orange by distinguishing it from red on one side and yellow on the other doesn't mean we have any sort of value attached to one color more than the others. And vague concepts actually abound. They're everywhere in our understanding of the world. So consider the concept of an adult as opposed to that of a juvenile, for instance. Some individuals are definitely juvenile, some are definitely adult. You might call them paradigm cases. And some individuals are vague. They have some adult characteristics and some juvenile characteristics. You don't become an adult overnight. And socially, we mark adulthood as if it happened to everyone at the same age, or, once you can pass this process. But this is a social convention that simplifies things, but actually falsifies the different aspects of the notion of adulthood. And we can distinguish sort of legal aspects from other social aspects and biological aspects from all those. So all these different things, drinking, sex, driving, marriage, joining the army, voting, right, all different ages, and they mark adulthood in various ways. But who really believes that everyone is at the same point in their development, at the same age, to the day, to the second? Right? Changing from a juvenile to an adult happens gradually. There's no last moment of being a juvenile and no first moment of being an adult. So, and similar to the contrast between being awake and being asleep, right? Even if you go from being awake to being asleep in a matter of seconds, you gradually move between those states. So, vagueness is a genuine phenomenon, not a side issue, and the paradigms approach suggests that the way we understand the vague concepts is not by focusing on borders but on central cases, and we make sense of particular instances by comparing them to paradigm or central cases. So we assess a hue by comparing it with the paradigms of red and paradigms of orange, say. And we assess a person's maturity by comparing them to a paradigm adult, a paradigm juvenile. So the lessons to glean from this is that a topic central to Western thought, contrary to the remarks of some, is vagueness, and vagueness is nothing like a blind spot. Philosophers and logicians in the tradition that comes down from the Greeks have an ongoing interest in vagueness, and so it should be. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.